Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. We're going in-depth on the ballot questions in advance of the November 4th election. In this segment, we're talking about a question that will appear on ballots in the lower and outer Cape towns that gauges voters' views on legalizing marijuana. It is a non-binding question that is appearing on ballots in 56 communities across the Commonwealth. The wording is to regulate and tax marijuana the same way as alcohol. I'm talking with Jack Cole, a retired police detective lieutenant who spent 26 years with the New Jersey State Police. He is a co-founder of the group Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which is campaigning in favor of this ballot question. Jack, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
You have a fascinating background. Can you give us an overview?
Yes, I retired as a detective lieutenant from a 26-year career in the New Jersey State Police, and for 14 of those years I worked undercover in narcotics. I worked everything up to billion-dollar international heroin and cocaine rings, and nothing I did in 26 years reduced the number of people abusing drugs in this country by so much as one person. As a matter of fact, it made it far, far worse.
Now, can you talk a little bit about your organization, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, known as LEAP, and how you got involved with it?
Certainly. I felt very bad when I retired for my role in implementing this, what I feel is not only a failed war on drugs, it's far worse. It's a self-perpetuating, constantly expanding policy disaster. Every year it's worse than it was the year before, and we've been doing it now for 44 years. So I sat down with 4 other police officers, and we created this organization called LEAP, or Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And the idea of LEAP is that we want to end drug prohibition around the world, just like we ended alcohol prohibition in this country in 1933, because as law enforcers we understand that the day after we ended that terrible law, Al Capone and all his smuggling buddies were out of business. They were off our streets. They were no longer out there killing each other to control that very lucrative market. They were no longer killing our children caught in crossfire and drive-by shootings. So we know if we legalize these drugs, we can take them out of the hands of the criminals and end this terrible prohibition gun violence that occurs today.
Now, how many members does LEAP have?
Well, we started 12 years ago with those 5 police officers. Today we have over 150,000 police, judges, prosecutors, prison officials, and supporters in 120 different countries. We were just accepted in April as a non-governmental organization with consultant status for the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs, because you can't just work on this locally. You have to work on it through the UN also if you're going to legalize and regulate and control drugs around the world.
And so is the goal of the organization having to do with all types of drugs and narcotics, or is it specifically focused on marijuana?
No, it's all drugs. We feel that the more dangerous the drug is, the more reason there is to legalize it, because after all, you cannot control or regulate anything while it's illegal. The control of these illicit drugs is in the hands of the criminals, and they haven't done such a good job for us.
I'm sure you have many, many friends and colleagues who are still in law enforcement or were in it back when you were in it. Does it lead to conflicts? Because I know we have some law enforcement officials on the Cape here who are strongly against this type of thing.
No, I don't think it leads to conflicts. It leads to disagreements. Some of them don't agree with us. Actually, we find that after we speak one-on-one with them, about 80% come over to our side. They agree with us. But there's not conflicts. You got to remember, Laura, that they and the members of LEAP both want to reduce drug abuse. That's our goal, and we spent our entire careers trying to do that. We haven't changed our mind about that. All we've changed our mind about is what kind of a policy will actually reduce drug abuse, and it is not prohibition of drugs.
Now, I guess similar non-binding questions about legalizing marijuana have been put before voters in Massachusetts. I think maybe 1/5 of voters twice before in 2010, 2012. And, of course, now we have this non-binding question. Is there an overall strategy towards legalization? People talk about perhaps in 2016 a binding question being put before voters. Is that right?
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and that you're going to see that in a lot of states for the legalization and regulation of marijuana so that we can control it. You've got to remember that our children, for the last 30 years in high school, they've said that it's easier to buy illegal drugs than it is to buy beer and cigarettes. So why don't we at least legalize this, regulate where it's going to be sold, regulate the age that it can be sold to, and make it as hard for our children to buy marijuana as it is to buy beer and cigarettes. By the way, those non-binding bills have started actually in 2000, and there's been 69 public policy questions concerning marijuana policy that have appeared on those ballots around the state since then. Every one of the 69 were approved by the voters and ignored by our elected representatives.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. We're talking about a non-binding ballot question before voters in the lower and outer Cape towns, as well as other towns throughout Massachusetts, about legalizing marijuana. Now, you've talked in general about the reasons for you being in favor of this and the failed war on drugs. What are some of your basic arguments for legalizing marijuana in addition to those you've already talked about?
You know, for 44 years, DEA has tried to block any kind of an investigation or study to see what marijuana would actually do if it is used. But recently, some studies have come out. There was two studies done by the University of Colorado and University of Utah that came out about a year ago, and they wanted to see if there was any correlation between the use of marijuana and an increase in fatal motor vehicle accidents and a use of marijuana and an increase in suicides, because that's what the drug warriors have been telling us for all these years. And when they actually did a study on this, they studied all the states that have legalized medical marijuana between the years of 1998 and 2007, and they went in and they ran the statistics before they legalized and after they had legalized for that period of time, and then they did the same thing in the surrounding states where they hadn't legalized, and they found there is correlations on both of those things, but it's not what the drug warriors would have you believe. In states that legalized marijuana, medical marijuana, the overall fatal motor vehicle accidents have declined by 9%. In states that have legalized medical marijuana, the overall suicide rate has declined by 5%. That's overall. But suicides among young men between the age of 20 and 29 have declined by 11%. And I think we should really think about that with our soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq and now perhaps Syria, and killing themselves, according to many studies, at rates faster than they were being killed in those wars. If we could save 11% of those, that would really be something, Laura. And the only other thing I would say about it is a new study just came out from JAMA on August 25th of this year. JAMA is the Journal of American Medical Association. It's probably one of the most respected groups in the world. And this study shows that in states that have legalized medical marijuana, there has been a drop in heroin overdose deaths. It has dropped by 24.8%. Now, that is an amazing thing. They're not even sure of the reason for it, but they are sure that that is what has happened.
Now, what about the dangers of addiction? People talk about that marijuana today is not the same as it was 30 years ago, much higher levels of THC, which is addictive. What would you say to those arguments?
Well, first off, the people on the other side have even actually changed definition of addiction from what it was for all the years that I worked on these drugs. When I started buying drugs back at the beginning of the war on drugs in 1970, undercover, to have an addiction meant that you had to, once you stop using a drug, you had to actually have a physical withdrawal from that drug. And that doesn't happen with marijuana. Marijuana is habituating. It is not addicting. By habituating, I mean if you use it and you like it, you're likely to go back to it. It's sort of like television, you know.
Now, what about the damage to young minds? There has been some research to say teenagers with still developing brains can be more heavily affected by marijuana.
Well, that may be true, and that is one of the reasons we want to legalize and regulate this drug. The reason these children, these teenagers, say they can get this drug easier than beer or cigarettes is because if they go into a local place where we regulate the sale of those legal drugs, they get carded. Somebody says, hey, are you old enough to buy this dope? Let me see an ID. And, of course, that's a question that's not going to be asked by their peers who want to sell this thing to them on the streets, or the child sitting one row away from them in your child's school. It's not going to ask that question. The only way you can regulate and control these drugs is by first legalizing them.
In the last minute or so we have left, any final words for voters on this issue?
Yeah, well, I think voters should say what they think about this. They should vote from a position of what they really feel, and if they do, they're going to be voting in favor of this because, as I say, since 2069 of these public policy questions concerning marijuana have appeared on the ballots, and every single one has been approved by the voters.
And unfortunately, we're out of time. We've been talking about a non-binding ballot question that will be before voters in the lower and outer Cape towns and other towns across Massachusetts about legalizing marijuana. I've been talking to retired police detective Jack Cole, who has been advocating on the issue. Thank you, Jack, so much for talking with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Laura.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. For more on our election coverage, go to our website, capecod.com, and click on the election banner.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at capecodbroadcasting.com.